Good afternoon. Hello, hello, hello. Thank you so much for joining us for episode 13 of season 3 of Black Writers Read. My name is Nicole Young Martin, and I am the founder, producer, and host of this series. There are so many important holidays happening at this time of year. Flowers and pollen are blooming, as you can probably tell from my red, watery eyes. It is getting warmer out. So I hope that you all are enjoying a beautiful season somewhere on the globe. And I hope that you are all surrounded by nothing but lovingly fulfilling experiences. Black Writers Read showcases, celebrates, and honors the words, work, and traditions of Black writers from across the country, across genres, across experiences, and across the African diaspora. Black Writers Read is a behind the scenes conversation into the craft and what it means to create as a Black author in today's society. Since starting the series during the summer of 2020, we've hosted 50 authors representing various genres, including children's books, young adult fiction, poetry, urban creative nonfiction, memoir, history, horror, essays, food, and culture from around the globe, including Western Massachusetts, Maryland, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Florida, upstate New York, New York's Hudson Valley, Philadelphia, Vermont, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Chicago, Virginia, Portugal, Costa Rica, and St. Martin. Today, we welcome Enzo Silon Surin. Enzo is a Haitian-born award-winning poet, educator, librettist, publisher, and social advocate. He is the author of 3 previous collections of poetry, including When My Body Was a Clinched Fist, published by Black Lawrence Press in 2020, and it is the winner of the 21st Annual Massachusetts Book Award for Poetry, and the forthcoming collection, American Scapegoat, which is also published by Black Lawrence Press, will be released next month. It is currently available for pre-order. He is co-author of Where We Stand, Poems of Black Resilience, which was published by Cherry Castle Publishing in 2022, and the recipient of a New England Poetry Club grant, a Brother Thomas Fellowship from the Boston Foundation, a Penn New England Discovery Award, and a 2020 Denis Diderot Grant as an artist in residence at Chateau. I hope I pronounced this correctly. Let me channel my French education. Chateau de Corveau in France. One thing that I definitely want to note about his work being a product of 2 countries, and it's a question that I actually asked them later in our conversation. Enzo has dedicated his life and career to affecting social change through creative and critical writing and gives voices to experiences that take place in what they call broken spaces. Surin teaches creative writing and literature at Bunker Hill Community College and is also founding editor and publisher at Central Square Press and founder and executive director at the Faraday Publishing Company Incorporated, a nonprofit literary service and social advocacy organization. You may have heard of Faraday Publishing Company prior coming out from me, as I have collaborated with them in the past. To learn more about Enzo, please visit their website at enzosurininc.org. That is ENZOSURININK.org. And throughout the episode, I'll be sharing that link. Today, we're going to chat about Enzo's latest poetry collections, When My Body Was a Clinched Fist, and American Scapegoat. American Scapegoat is a book of painstakingly honest and chilling poems about America's neglectful relationship with its own history. At the core of this reluctance to frame the past in its proper context is the fraudulent and fraught mythology that Black people are what America needs to be protected from. I'm so excited to talk about this book. So a little bit of background, because we do have, I'm fortunate enough to have an outside relationship with Enzo separate from Black Writers Read. So I first met Enzo in 2021 when Black Writers Read was invited to collaborate with Faraday Publishing Company on the panel, A Stranger in My Own Home, Black Experiences Within the American Literary Canon for the Tell It Slant Festival that September. I worked with Enzo and Michael Mercurio, who is a huge supporter of Black Writers Read. He is the Director of Community Engagement for Faraday Publishing, to curate the panel. This is also when I first met Lisa Pegram, who has been on Black Writers Read and has helped me to program much of Season 2 and Season 3. During our first meeting, I was starstruck, as I've heard of Enzo and their work prior to us working together. There is such a deep vulnerability in witnessing that emerges in his work, something that I hope all writers aim for their work to do. I've wanted to chat with Enzo on Black Writers Read for the longest time, longing for my personal masterclass with them, yet also for the Black Writers Read community to have time with him as well. For those of you who are new to Black Writers Read, here's the format of the show. Enzo will read an excerpt from their work. We will then chat, and if time remains at the end of our conversation, we'll open it up to Q&A for those who are joining us today. We have viewers joining us from both Facebook and YouTube. If you have a question, please feel free to include it in the comment section on the platform where you're joining us from today. I will compile the questions and either post them to our guests following our conversation or insert them during an appropriate time. I'd now like to bring Enzo onto the virtual stage. Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much. I've been waiting a long, long time to be on this wonderful, wonderful podcast and to have the conversation we're about to have today. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. I've been so much looking forward to this, and I'm not gonna lie, I've had this for some time, and I've just been
Nice.
like, I now got to get my copy though with the sticker on it that says
Yeah, I
the
just
award
realized
winner.
that. I was like, wait, So we'll make sure you get a sticker.
Oh, thank you. So the stage is yours. Have fun reading.
Oh, thank you. I want to start off with a poem titled Weather, which is in my forthcoming collection, American Scapegoat. And I think it's the right way for us to start this conversation today. Weather, an American libretto. Whether or not you believe in weather, it will happen to you. Will find you without warning, it doesn't care. Whether or not it hurts is of no consequence, nor a building or levees collapse, or the trees and the wind and nature's fury. A mother country with no deal to be made and with no care about whether or not you have been under the weight of an unready, murderous rain, and that your life regiment is regimes doesn't matter. Whether or not despots have already marked these spots with death, the earth rumbled and crumbled huts and monuments alike, like it didn't matter. Whether or not we made a living out of the sum of dirt underneath our fingernails, or that it paled in comparison to the flamboyant trees retreat out of reach, or whether or not we were heard, or that our history was misread, or that we believed despite being misled, or that we were the orphans of a republic that is both bullet and barrel, spitting our carapace like a cell splits the body into hemospheres, both air and trumpet, spitting our chords into a memo read like an omen, spitting our chords into particles and articles of refuse. We matter like groans matter in the slum, like leathery skin in the summer sun, or like the sum of a skillful gun that knows, whether we moan or not, our absences will never trump the lowest breath snuffing us out. Doesn't matter whether we creak these lip hours in a perpetual sweat, or that we quit that dumb udder that prowls that winter that mellows our minds without hesitation. The adage that keeping it real is dicing our breath on the defiant air, courting records, and it's worth it. Doesn't matter whether we create that dumb other without deliberation. The bench is peeled with bygone bullets under the duress of flight, or the syphilitic revolvers that render the block cold as mines. Whether we pay our respects in the thug air of a mean retreat, bereft of days, bereft of nights, when we create that dumb other that says some are born to smile. Doesn't matter whether we create the trap that rendered us neutral. Noise which crows all correction is connection. The obligatory dictation of mouths exalting us for our trilingual amputations, that pillage choice, that pad boon our voice. Whether or not we create noise which gleans all things correctional as correction, that thing which causes us to hone moan as anthem. Grown so long we mime life, backslash black. This what we did before hypomnesia, memory gone so long we homegrown. Or whether or not we quit that unmistakably labored tone, the umbilical hazing of our sanctuaries. Or whether or not many of us drew dirt prematurely. Or genealogy of deficit that begot too many names we'll never learn to know by heart. Doesn't matter whether we're still standing and free, our mouths deciphering the saline of tears from all other salty liquids, the masses of our own hope and despair, inciting, reciting a hello grin as we wade in the science of goodbye to pry that exilic snowflake from the barrels of our throat. We wake, we wake, we wake, we wake. It never mattered whether or not our dreams were real or were abated, or if the weight alone was worth its weight in being elated, it didn't matter. We've always known we matter like heartbeats in a drum, like the sum of a skillful gun that knows whether we hone moans, groans, or absences will never trump the lower breath snuffing us out. As I mentioned, this poem is from my forthcoming collection, When My Body, American Scapegoat, excuse me, throughout this May. And I really wanted to start a conversation about what it means. And the weather that I talked about here, of course, is WHETHER. And it's the aspect, the conversation about whether or not somebody chooses to believe that whatever is happening to you is real. It doesn't matter, right? Because it's real and we know that. And so it is about giving voice to experiences, knowing that there's you know, quite a few people that may not believe that what you're talking about is actually happening. And for a very long time, we talked about how Black Lives Matter. Of course, the retort was, Blue Lives Matter or All Lives Matter. And it wasn't negating all the other lives. It wasn't saying that they didn't matter, but it was saying that there's something very specific that's happening with Black lives as it relates to, American policy and the enforcement of such policies. And there's a history connected to that, right? And so the poem is actually a bit longer than what I shared with you, but it does give you a breath, at least at this point, right? About what I'm talking about when we say we're going to support each other, we're going to be advocates for each other. Part of this is really starting the conversation. If we're going to have a much bigger scale conversation, starting it on a level of honesty, talking about where we come from, but also talking about the history of this nation as it relates to the treatment of Black people. I want to connect that to my collection, When My Body Was a Clenched Fist, because it does chronicle the experiences of a young Black boy growing up in Queens, New York. And it chronicles my childhood there. And it really addresses something that I think is understated oftentimes. When someone grows up in a very difficult environment and they become subject to the treatment, whether it's by police or by folks in that environment, or even on a political scale, right? As if, they're not victims of that situation, as if they asked for it, as if they want things to be exactly the way these conditions exist. And so a lot of times folks fail to take into consideration that while going through this, the young people especially, right? Like there's an essence of their emotional well-being that is not being considered. And in this case, I'm talking about the pathology of, the traumatic situations that they witness on a daily basis, and how eventually that affects their bodies. And I wanted to start with a poem that deals with one of the most traumatic situations that I experienced, because I witnessed something that happened and there was no shaking it. And it is the title poem to the manuscript, to the book When My Body Was a Clenched Fist, and it's a poem titled My Body as a Clenched Fist. I'm only going to read the first two parts of this poem because it is in 5 parts, and each section represents a digit of the hand. And so if you put all of them together, you get the clenched fist. But I wanted to address all 5 sections as it relates to title, because I often think that trauma really mimics mutation. And so having a love for X-Men, having a love for mutants and so forth, I recognize that, a mutation of sorts is very similar to a traumatic experience, in that, the first part is affliction, right? When something happens. And so let's say, Peter Parker gets bitten by a spider. And the second part is aftermath, which is something feels strange, right? And all of a sudden, Peter Parker kind of feels funky, right? And then third is metamorphosis, in which now something starting to happen, touches a wall or something and his hand sticks to that wall. And then retaliation is when you start to reject this change and saying, this can't be happening to me. No way, I don't want it, right? And then the last part is revolution, which is when everything has taken over and you can't hide the fact that you're Spider-Man, right? And so then you have to deal with that. And so as a young kid trying to figure out, did this really happen? And then you go through the progressions of this. And so I'm reading the first 2 sections because, affliction and aftermath is really the jump off to any of these situations. And actually, a lot of the poems that I'm going to be reading today and the conversation we're going to have deal with those two sections, affliction and aftermath. When something happens, and then what then? My body as a clenched fist. It was a gust. No, it was a burst of air that brought the coil to my hands time and again. And no matter what I did to flex, it didn't budge and almost always brought me back to Leon walking besides me. Then it once felt motion not there except for the treads of his shoes making its way down a street he didn't know was a one way, the wrong way. When he doubled back, it was clear that something cannibalized the way home. I vetted the treetops for a place to perch, a vantage point beyond the crowd that had gathered to watch the fight, but there was no fight. It was all one-sided. 7, strike that. 10, strike that. 18, strike that. 20 pair of fists and Timberland boots bear down into the boy, and the only sight of fight in him was his body balling up like a fist to brace the rush of even more fists. What could I do? What could I have done? They had begun to also cannibalize passers-by and onlookers. I did what was customary, collected faces for the diurnal course, when there'd be another way to put fear and the cheers into a vista that would involve more fist. That day never came. And when a fury this strong begins to court a young fist, when anger is calibrated with fondness for rancor, there is only one end. To fight monsters, you must yourself become a monster. Aftermath. There was no sign it ever took place. No dents in the universe. No visible wounds from where the paratroopers landed their blows. No traces of Leon. No parallel bruise in your ribs or spine. Just beautiful, beautiful, beautiful sun. No physical wreckage, shards of bone, no raging fire or smoldering carcass. Just an echo in your bones and veins, in the fists you pack for the day. Just beautiful, beautiful, beautiful sun. No shortcuts, same street, same trees, and you staring at yourself like the body's purpose was to harbor this universe of cavity wide enough to muse. Maybe there was still a way, so certain there was still a way to walk away or undo what was done, but with no body, no witnesses, no one to talk to, no Leon back at school, no sign the universe was ever disturbed except in your bones and in the loaded fist carried in your pocket. You sat in class, reviewed homework like you always did, later at recess, in that odd, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful sun, whispering to the ball in your hand, shot taker and rebounder, because even at 13, you already knew that sometimes teeth are a gateway to the city of one's own understanding, and other times they are a gate for what ails, and with no credible witness to corroborate other than your own reflection in storefront windows, the ceaseless parading of two bodies, a balancing double-barrel pair of fists, you settled into the glaring aftermath, alone, glazed in that beautiful, 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 beautiful sun. Sometimes when you experience a very earth-shattering sort of thing and it changes who you are, what compounds the trauma is what happens next. When you tell someone, here's what I experienced, and they don't believe you. And at the heart of this is really, what do you do with that, right? I mentioned revolution in the end when you know that something has happened. And in this case, I kind of mentioned, who do I talk to about this, right? As a young person, I felt like I couldn't talk to anybody about this. And who would believe me, right? As I mentioned, like the street the next day was filled with foot traffic, with car traffic, and so forth, as if nothing had happened. And Leon was not around, and no one else was around. And so all of a sudden, you say, did I imagine it, right? Did it really happen? And then you realize that that was the tucking, right? And so when I talk about my body being a clenched fist, it was all of these experiences being tucked away. And as such, when you take a look at what's happening around you, the more tucking you do, the more closed off you become, right? And in my case, I was really protecting, right, who I was. As I mentioned the first, in the last line in that first section, to fight monsters, you must yourself become a monster. So in a lot of ways, you have to decide, do I want to participate and to retaliate in this way? Or do I make the decision to be, to remain myself? And in that, if that's the case, what are you going to need to do, right? What are your next steps to make sure that you remain who you are? And at the time, it wasn't quite clear, other than preserve whatever you have into a fist, right? Lock it in within your hand and protect it. And that's exactly what I did. Now, American Scapegoat is really picking up from that, right? Because as much as I talk about social violence, um, in when my body was a clenched fist, and even a little bit of police brutality as well in there, and how policy really victimizes people as well. And so I kind of said, like, if I had shown myself to be, quote unquote, and the terms that we were using back then too was a menace to society, right? And it was easier for them to label people as menaces to society versus people who are grappling with um, a lot of situations that, and they can't handle it, right? But because I was quiet, sensitive, and I kept to myself, I didn't bring a lot of attention. I didn't get into fights. I didn't, I wasn't acting outwardly, but there was a war inside of me, inward, right? Inside. And so I took everything inward. And that's why I was like, okay, if I don't show up that way, then no one is really checking for me. And so the advocacy of that is really making sure that we do check in on people, because eventually you get older and then you grow up and you say, okay, maybe I have come to terms with what happened. American Scapegoat is, it's like, okay, I've grown up and I've made it through all these situations as a youth, but I'm still not feeling safe in the environment that I grew up in. One particular poem I want to share with you is a poem, and I'm reading this poem for the very first time, as part of any reading. But it's a poem about Freddie Gray and what happened in Baltimore. I remember all the news cycle, the headlines were why they, rioting in Baltimore, why they, um, burning down their own neighborhoods and burning down stores and so forth. And I kept asking the question, they're seeing things that are happening again outwardly, right? Does anyone take a few seconds to think about what may be happening inside? And not just looking at the history of, police relationship with the Black community in Baltimore, which is it's not hidden, it's there. So you can research it. But more so, did anyone think about what it might be like to be Freddie Gray? Like, this happened to a human being, right? And then no charges were brought up, and that it was seen as an unfortunate situation. And so I couldn't, that didn't sit well with me. And so I ended up writing this poem titled Gray's Anatomy, the Freddie Gray Suite. And I'm going to read for you the first three sections of that. And yeah, so I'll just read it so we can have a conversation about this. So Gray's Anatomy, the Freddie Gray Suite. Imagine a tin can's semi-erratic clang as it is transported without restraint in the back of an empty, lauded truck. Imagine a rag doll, or the fling of a mop's flop, or a rogue, freshly peeled honeydew melon at the mercy of the groove floor bed of a truck. Imagine a shellless soft-boiled egg or baked sweet potato rolling off the makeshift counter of a bench. Imagine it being tossed in the truck, like it is born of a Dunsack nation. Imagine it has ears and can hear itself crack open. Imagine you can hear it crack open in the back of a truck, and it sounds like a tea kettle whistling. Imagine it is the sound the throat makes when it has broken away from its voice box. Imagine a man attached to the voice and the throat and the sound of a cry that sounds like something is cracked open. And imagine he tosses haplessly in that metal truck and nobody gives a fuck. Not the driver of the truck or how the man's body failed to flutter to the ground as he lost consciousness. How the clanging of cuffs were one of the last sounds he heard, and how his gut may have felt when he entered the back of that truck. He was on the verge of being relegated to compost. 2. Depraved heart murder is sixth, alphabetically, under terms for homicide in U.S. criminal law. Comes right before execution-style murder, which by definition is when one is killed at close range, which is to say in close proximity, and under complete physical control of an assailant, and who has been left with no chance of resistance or escape. This is to say, When they clicked their own seatbelts, they knew the law, knew the risk of death or injury, and kept on driving. They knew the law because they were the law. That itself was clear. But this was Baltimore, and Be More was not just a dub but an omen for the truth. As in, it could not be any more apparent that being black means you have signed a poor lease, and blue coats know all that laws, and blue coats know all about laws and the savor of just how to break them. Radical revolution begins with a revelation. At the end of values and the number of times one forces the mind and tries to rehab hope as alternate ending to a life being hauled, cuffed in the back of a van so the hands could not brace fall a bull rush of swerves. Because we don't lose the same, he was left to a hush of nerves, premature ending, and 3 fractured vertebrae in a crushed voice box. No matter who consented or whose myths about breeds, doves black men fugitive, whose news make one alter an epistle in another grave, or whose blue lines the streets too often. Radical rotation begins with loss, which means being woke is never the same as being awake in one's own body. And because we don't lose the same amount of sleep, not over 3 fractured vertebrae or a crushed voice box, it is all a tragic end. And one does not need eyes to see this. Place a hand on the page, and you can make out the breaking of his voice. It is like the clearing of your throat. I really wanted to address how easily things are forgotten, and that people move on, right? People move on. And so I started to ask this question because I didn't feel safe. And certainly raising 2 young black boys who are as beautiful as ever in this world, I didn't feel like I could keep them safe. And so the next poem is a poem that I wrote. It is all questions because I didn't have any answers. And so at some point I wanted to ask and hoping that somebody will provide me with this answer. When night fills with premature exits, is there a place where black men can go to be beautiful? Is there light there, touch? Is there comfort or room to raise their black sons as anything other than a future asterisk, at risk to be asteroid or rogue planet, but not comet, to be studied with awe and clamor, and admired for radial trajectories across a dark sky made of asphalt and moonshine, to be celebs and deemed a magnificent sight? And I wanted to end here with a set of questions, and the premise that I'm not sure where we're going from here, but at some point, I believe we get to decide the answer to these questions together. And are we willing to have the tough conversations to make that happen? So thank you for listening, and I look forward to a discussion.
Ooh. I needed to take like a really deep breath. Like, oh. Wow. Like, and I was reading along as you were reading aloud, and I'm like, well, I have a lot of questions, of course, but like the first thing I want to acknowledge, like, and I know you're a librettist as well, like just the way in which, because I've read your work, of course, but it lands a lot differently on the soul when you hear it.
Yeah.
Are you looking to record like as audiobooks any of your work?
I am. I'm actually, it's a good question because I started to send, one of my tribe members, Kaylee Pezzi, started to send me these recorded poems, right, as a way of inspiring me. And so I would send her something back, and then I realized that I became obsessed with this idea of recording these poems because while doing that, I became a bit more comfortable with my voice, which I had shied away from. I didn't want to be, just read it, I figured, but then I started to record them and I realized that they came to life a bit more. And that, as you mentioned, the music is often lost, right? And so being a librettist, like music is always a part of my writing process. And so there's always something playing when I'm writing in the background or when I'm cooking, wherever, right? And there's always music. And so I figure, why not read them in a way that that brings out the music? And I'm hoping, right? I'm hoping that this will translate into an audiobook.
Nice.
Although I've been recording some of the poems for American Scapegoat, and I've been posting them on SoundCloud, as if I'm releasing an album or something.
Yes.
But I love the fact that they come to life in that way, and I'm hoping, especially for American Scapegoat, to have a lot of these poems, or to even have the whole collection as an audiobook.
Wow. Because it's still, and it's like, and also just listening to you and like the rhythm and like the cadence and everything that's present, and just like how each stanza can live as its own. I'm like, this is exactly
Yeah.
why I became a poet after listening
Mm,
to poets like you. And I'm like, they're neat, like just the unique way in which you tell your story and tell your
mm,
stories. I'm just like,
yeah.
like giving flowers, giving flowers.
Yeah. Well,
So I
thank
want to,
you.
so I
Thank
want to,
you.
yes. So I want to start with my first question, which
Yes.
is understanding the origin stories of both When
Yes.
My Body Was a Clenched Fist and American Scapegoat. So what are their origin stories? And I also want to acknowledge that I believe When My Body Was a Clenched Fist was published during the height of the pandemic lockdown.
Yeah.
Um, so if you would like to go into the origin stories of each collection, and then
Yes.
also how did each find their titles, as the titles are just so like pow. It's like, yep, this is what's gonna happen.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think for a very long time I had known that I needed to address um, what happened in my childhood, right? And so the word trigger comes to mind, right? Because at some point, the title of the manuscript for When My Body Was a Clenched Fist was Born to Triggers. There's actually a poem in there titled that. Um, you know, Shout out to the late Kamal Brathwaite, incredible poet. And he had this poem, Born to Slow Horses. And the way the cadence in that flowed, and he was just telling this epic story. And I kept thinking about how there was a lot more to tell, right, about that experience, but how do you frame it? Um, and I was doing a reading, and Emily Pettit, a wonderful collection, Goat in the Snow, and she has this repetition with the titles, right? And I realized that I kept saying, born, you know, birth of a clenched fist, right? That was one of the titles. And then I said, well, why don't I name the rest of them fist, right? And then became elegy,
Yes.
of clenched fist, and then this of a clenched fist. And I was like, wait a minute, clenched fist. So instead of born to triggers, why don't you name this for what it is, right? So I was like, okay, what should be the title? It wasn't until I got around to My Body as a Clenched Fist that I said, oh, this collection is When My Body Was a Clenched Fist. And that's a long title, right? And so I was like, oh, it should be shorter than that. I said, no, that's the story. And we're going to do that. And so it was about trying to capture the process by which the body becomes traumatized and protects itself and then unveils itself, right? At some point. Now, American Scapegoat itself was part of another manuscript. And it was, it's a manuscript titled Rumors of Our Demise. And this manuscript kept growing because eventually the events that took place, starting with Trayvon Martin, but then before that as well, and growing up in New York, I was just like, oh, all of this sounds like this is the same thing. Abner Louima, it sounded like all of these folks. And I was like, wow, so this hasn't changed much. And so it became how this, young boy grew up, had survived his environment, and then was facing all of this stuff as if no time had passed. And so I kept writing more and more during the pandemic, right? Because here was my book coming out during the summer of the pandemic, but it wasn't the summer of the pandemic. It was summer of 2020, right? And so I was excited. And then, this happened, you know? And so then it became, well, how do I have these conversations and be out there, you know? And sort of tour dates and all that stuff got pushed and some got canceled. But the beauty of that was being able to have, you know, video, you know, conferences, video readings, but also class visits as well. And it echoed some of what I had addressed in the book, because a lot of people shared their experiences with me, and I realized, okay, this wasn't just about you. That there are other clenched fists out there that haven't been revealed yet, and American Scapegoat is about that as well. Because how do you go through a pandemic while, you know, experiencing the other stuff that was happening that people wanted to ignore, right? And so it was like Black Lives Matter, Black Lives, and no one was listening, really. And so at some point I was like, okay, I need to write about this, but I didn't want to write from just the headlines about what was happening. And I've always been that way. I want to write from a space that I'm comfortable with. And if everybody else is already saying it, I don't need to contribute to that, right? I can support them, but I don't need to be repeating what everybody else is doing. So I sat back, and then one day I was just like, okay, you have all of these poems and you feel like, oh, time has passed you by, but it's still very relevant. And so then I was like, okay, let's do this. But I had to split the manuscript because I realized that this collection itself had grown to like 80 pages on its own. And so I was like, okay, we can't have a manuscript that's, you know, 200 something pages, right? You gotta. So I split it in half, and then the half that became American Scapegoat was actually supposed to be published, at least I had planned it, after Rumors of Our Demise. But then the zeitgeist, right, of the time says, no, this is relevant now. Let's publish this now, or let's send it out now, right? And Black Lawrence Press was just incredible in their reception of it, but also the timeliness of it. And like, we need to publish this 2023 because we know what's going to happen in 2024. Like the cycle of that started in 2016, right, is going to come back around, and the conversation is still very relevant, and we get to have it in a very different way.
Wow. I feel like so many deities plan this conversation, because it's like the questions that I have are going to land so perfectly. When My Body Was a Clinched Fist, which was published in 2020, starts a dialogue of witnessing a particular Black life. An American Scapegoat, which is coming out next month, expands to include Black lives, plural. So can you talk about how your literary voice, you talked a little bit earlier about it, but expand more about how your literary voice has evolved between the two books, and then how American Scapegoat continues that conversation?
It's a great question, and the answer is going to sound a bit awkward at first, right? Because I'm a writer, I'm a publisher, you know, teacher of creative writing, so I'm, you know, all things literary. But the conversation really started by infusing the work with non-literary traditions, right? And so a lot of this is about, like, there's film in this as well, right? I mentioned being a librettist, and so there is music, right, in this. But the idea that I can zoom in and tell a story and then zoom out so you can see it from a different angle, right? I need to infuse the collection with that, right? But how do I do that and still feel like this will be published? At some point, I had to say, well, I don't really care as much, because if it's going to be rejected, I at least want to put everything that I have in it, right? And so when it went from giving myself the freedom to write When My Body Was a Clenched Fist in my own way, by having New York City in it, right? From the music to the language, mannerism, like even the words function like people from New York, right? There's a lot of, you know, enjambment in there. There's a lot of words, you know, a lot of repetition, right? That a lot of words that fold upon themselves, and you kind of like, that have like 50,000 meanings, right? And then you say to yourself, well, how do you do that? What if they're, I was like, no, whatever you think it means, either one of those definitions will work. And so it was about maintaining, for me, my own voice which I think is very tough. As I mentioned, I wanted to write something not everybody else was saying, right? Or they were saying it, but not in the way that I was saying it. And I wasn't aiming to be different, but I recognized that I was different. I have different experiences. And as someone who was Haitian-born, it means that I have a different perspective of American culture, the Black American experience, especially. And blending those in there was tricky at first, but when I gave myself permission to write about those things, I think it allowed me to get to the heart of all of it, right? Because what story do you want to tell is very different than the story that the world said they're available to receive. And I think I kind of said to myself, well, if it doesn't matter if I get rejected or not, then I'm going to write the work that I want to write. And maybe I'll be like Emily Dickinson, right? Way after I'm gone, somebody will, dust off my manuscript and be like, who is this? Who is this Enzo Silon Surin, Because my guess is because we're humans, right? That a lot of this will still be relevant, no matter when you read it.
Yeah. So speaking of continuing conversations, the poems in When My Body Was a Clenched Fist seemed to me as a call and response. I'm also a musician as well, for those who are joining us. I actually started off as a musician, left it, and
I didn't even know of that. All the wonderful things I know you do. Now I know we're going to be talking way
Yeah, we have to.
Wow.
Have to. Yeah. So it's a call and response where it feels like they're in conversation with one another. In particular, the poems "High School English" and "Highs" apostrophe S "Cool English," where the first poem ends with this stanza. So "High School English" ends like this: "Tomorrow's a standard deviation where we live, the weight of which depends on small silences we fit ourselves into." And "Highs" "Cool English" picks up with "We fit ourselves into small silences, the width of which depends on where we live. Tomorrow's standard deviation, bit no explanations, conceal your syntax." So I absolutely love the style and word choice for each.
Thank you.
Yes. So can you talk about the process of curating When My Body Was a Clenched Fist and how you put these works in conversation with one another? Because one of the things that I've noticed too is there's several poems in between the two. So I'm like, how do how do they pick up one another? Which I just think is such a brilliant choice.
Well, it's funny because looking at it, and thank you so much for picking up on the technical aspects of those two poems. And I think I was going through the process of writing them, and I can't remember, it was a conversation I was having with my mentor, Kate Marvin, and it's like I want to do something different, right, with this collection. But as I'm writing it, I think it was something that she said that made me feel like, okay, you can do this, right? So I just said, what if I just put, an apostrophe? Because at some point she says, it's okay to title these poems the same, but I consider the titles a remix, right? And so again, coming of age with hip hop, music was very much a part of this, especially hip hop, rap music. So I said, there's always a remix, and sometimes the remix is like gives you a completely different take. You're still vibing to it, but so I was like, let me remix this poem. And so in a lot of ways, some of the poems I consider to be, singles. And so in which case it's a mixtape of sorts, right? The variation, but also, again, it's the echo, right? And with trauma, a lot of it trauma is a mirror of sorts, right? Because you're seeing yourself inflicted, as I mentioned in that, afflicted, I should say, you see yourself in those storefront windows, right? It's two versions of yourself. So you still look like you, but you're not you. You're not the same person. And, in sound, we call it an echo, right? But in text, it's, how do you do that, right? Because visually it's a mirror, right? A reflection. In sound, it's an echo. So how do you do that? How do you illustrate that in a poem? Well, flip it, right? Flip it around. So in this case, I wanted a lot of the poems to do what they were going to do. And because they were based on memory, I allowed the collection to develop as memory develops, because memory is never really linear.
Mm.
You remember one thing and then something else. And then you wake up and you say, okay, now I'm going to talk about this. And you're like, oh, it sounds like that because it is connected to that. But it doesn't happen in a linear way. So I said, well, how can I write this? And I just woke up and I was just like, I'm just going to write it. Like, and I'm just going to do it. And any 5 poems that you read, no matter which 5, in any order, you get the essence of the Clinched Fist. And so once I realized that was happening, it didn't matter fully how I decided, to place these poems. Now, some are extremely, the one thing I was cautious of was triggers, right? Um, a lot of these are extremely tough poems to write and to read, and I didn't want to trigger my readers. And so 5 poems is what I recommend, but also how it's arranged, you get the essence of something. But before you get completely lost in the crowd, in what's going on, I zoom out a little bit and I give you a chance to take a breath. I said, take a breath before you go back in. By the way, do you see this? Do you see this bus? Do you see all of this stuff? And I wanted that to move through. But if you think about it, that's an album, right? Or that's a film in itself. And funny enough, though, I wrote this. Yes, there's a lot of music. The music ends up being a soundtrack because I considered each poem a scene, right? Whether it's the character sitting there reflecting on an experience or whether you're there with them as things are happening. I always imagine When My Body Was a Clenched Fist as a film. In fact, I still want somebody to pick up, Ava DuVernay, and be like,
Ooh,
hey,
can we put that? Can we call out to existence Ava DuVernay, who I'm a huge fan
hey.
of? Can you please?
um,
Can you please?
because I would love the story to be told in that way, and because it has, this poetry as part of it, and how the life of a poet in a situation like that, to have those tools to be able to talk about it, makes it extremely, poetry is valuable in that way. And so I wanted to pay homage to that, but not keep myself tied to any sort of, very specific forms. In whatever way the poem wanted to come, I did it. If it was a sonnet, if it was something else, I'm going to do it. If it was just a stream of consciousness, like Pathology of a Clenched Fist, which is in the poem, and I just talk about what's a fist in life? How is that represented? And it was just a definition exercise for me. And I was like, oh, that's actually a poem. So ploop, I plopped it in there, and it serves as a good marker for people when they read it.
Nice. So Dr. Tara Betts, who was a guest on Black Writers Read earlier this season, offers for the book this following quote. It interrogates how masculinity is so often flexed like the knuckles of an ever-ready fist, even when vulnerability pulses underneath. So in this book, you cite a quote from Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score.
Yes.
What is your clenched fist as illustrated in the poetry collection, and how does When My Body Was a Clenched Fist interrogate trauma and the body, as you kind of sort of mentioned? And I also want to note to folks, and I think this is just so important to acknowledge, that the title, and I kept like saying this to myself, When My Body Was a Clenched Fist is written in past tense.
Yes.
So I do need to acknowledge,
Yeah.
like that was I feel like plays like that time
Yeah.
plays an important role
A
in
very
this
good question.
here.
And, shout out to Tara Betts. I love Tara Betts, and we've had some conversations about even poetics, right? And being able to be yourself, right, as you write. And she did pick up on, the sensitivity aspect of it, because this book was as much about, growing up Queens, New York, and that as it was about masculinity, right? And what ways do we expect Black men to react, right? But men in general, right? How do you expect me to react to such things? And one of the things that, there's like this rhyme, and I'm forgetting who said it, but it's like everybody, at some point, everybody dies in these streets, right? And that a certain part of you, like you have to kill a certain part of yourself to be able to live. And some people kill the nice, quiet, sensitive part, right? And become tougher, right? And louder and so forth. And in my case, it was, well, I'm going to keep that part and I'm going to try to destroy the part that's saying, no, we need to do this. Well, we got to do something, right? Or you're going to let them get away with this? And I realized that in doing that, my body was always in conflict. And, Kendrick Lamar in his song, says, these days of frustration keep y'all untucked in rotation. And it's like there was this frustration, like I can't control my environment, but it doesn't seem like I can control this mutation either, right? So what do I do with it? I always think about how restless it is for someone to exist in that way, right? And so you're always on the move. And so restlessness is of course now another word for anxiety, right? And so I don't know what to do. I don't know what is going to happen. What if something happens, right? Can I react to it? Okay, if I react to what's going to happen? And I could always see 10 steps forward, right? And at the end, everybody loses because eventually there's no such thing as I'm just going to do this once, because then somebody responds and then another person responds and then that person responds and then it continues, right? It's a cycle. And so I wanted to show what it looks like to do that. And in the book, The Body Keeps the Score was, funny enough, I had written the collection, but as a person who majored in psychology and sociology, right? And I was reading, I was in love with, I was reading psych books about psychosomatics, and multiple personality disorders, and schizophrenia when I was in high school. And I was reading it for fun because I wanted to learn these things. I said, there's no way anyone is going to believe all this happened. Okay, well, if they're not going to believe it, write it in a way that frames it for them. And I do think as a writer, that is the job that we have, right? To not just tell a story, but to help our readers understand the story by framing it in a context that they could understand. So in that way, you're staying true to the experience, but at the same time, you're saying, hey, take a look at this, right? With Freddie Gray, it was, okay, if you can't imagine what a human body looks like in the back of a police truck, right? Without their harness. Imagine, a honeydew melon. Imagine a rag doll. Imagine this. Because you can see it, right? You can see someone looking at, or a can in the back of a truck. I know people who say, hey, I've gone grocery shopping and a can got out. And they pull over because they can't stand the boop, 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 right? Of the can. So I said, oh, if that's the case, imagine a body. Now imagine that body is Freddie Gray. It doesn't matter what you believe, what politics, whatever it is, blue lives, all lives, any life, right? It doesn't matter. A human being was left in the back of a truck, and I wanted you to be in that space because I want to know, do you recognize what happened? And do you accept it as the truth? Because if you can't do that, then we can't have a conversation. You cannot be my ally, nor can we have a conversation about moving on. And so then we get placed in different categories, right? As the people that it doesn't matter what the truth is, they're still going to believe what they believe. And that's okay. But at least I can put you in that category. And if you're not willing to put yourself in that category, I'm going to write in a way that puts you in that allows you to put yourself in that category. So in a lot of ways, it is about, letting people know what it's like to be in that space. And the past tense that you mentioned is because I had become a father, right? And so at some point, having those sons, I realized that's what I was holding inside of my hand. It was them. It was the promise of them. Because being a father that's full of hugs, right? Loving, comfort in that way, right? And processing the world. Like, there's no way I would have been that person if I had chosen all the other stuff. I even argue and say I probably wouldn't even be here to even birth children, right? Bring children into the world, right? And so all of a sudden I said, well, this is it. This is what I was trying to do. I was trying to protect that part of myself so that loving wasn't as difficult as it would have been, right? being gentle, being sensitive, and all that stuff, right? And being masculine in a way that's not, you know, folded into the narrative that you got to be, you know, fighting, right? You got to be um, reacting in some way that, you know, I mean, I sort of had this jarring experience when the whole Will Smith situation happened, right? With Chris Rock. And so I was kind of like, you know, when I got on social media a little bit and I said, you know, I'm not going to get into the folds of this about right or wrong, but I'm like, is this what we expect? You know, because I heard all this stuff about, yeah, you know, it's what a man should do. He stood up as a man, as a man, as a man. And I just kept thinking about, wow. So we still have the same definition of masculinity. And so if that's the case, we're going to continue to have a problem with black males in general, because that's what the world is saying all black men are like. You know, that's the narrative. And so all of a sudden, am I going to be able to be seen? And my boys who are beautiful and sensitive and intelligent, are they going to be able to be seen? And that's when that poem was relevant. You know, when night fills with premature exits, it was like, it stemmed from that because I grew up with that. And so all of a sudden, how do I teach my boys to not, you know, fold themselves into that narrative? Yeah.
This is exactly why I love your work so much.
Thank you.
Your writing gives voice to the experiences that take place in these broken spaces.
Yes.
So can you, this is like, as I always do, a 5-part question. Can you describe what these broken places are and then talk about the process of caring for yourself? And my assistant, Candace De Leon, helped me come up with this question. Can you describe what these broken spaces are and then talk about the process of caring for yourself when writing such work, which I can imagine can be quite vulnerable? How do you ensure that you've made space for self-care and self-check when giving life for these broken spaces? And then how does one stay safe when writing from and of these broken spaces?
Well, I would say the first thing is writing is therapeutic, but writing is not therapy. Right. And so, and I'll say it, writing is therapeutic, but writing is not therapy. So if you're going to do the work, you're going to be triggered. And you have to have a support system. You have to have friends that help you. I remember calling my friend Melanie Henderson, you know, part of our Next Verse Poets Connective, which Lisa Pegram and Fred Joyner are part of as well. So the four of us always have these conversations about us as people first, and then the poem. And so I always say, I just wrote something, or I'm thinking about something. And then I can write it and then I can send it to them because then it's an audience of one, right? But at the same time, the was in that title is because I had gone through, you know, therapy. I had gone through the process of self-reflection and introspection and figuring things out. And so in writing it, it was still challenging, but I knew where my support system was. And I often say to poets, because I had an experience where I was on the Orange Line, I was writing, I think, a poem from this, and tears started to stream from my eyes. And I remember thinking, okay, maybe you should have waited a few more minutes, right, until you were in a different space, because you never know. And so I always say, make sure that you have your support system and friends. Make sure that you're not shy, you know, with seeing a therapist, because you're going to need to deal with the effects of that, not only as you're going through it, but when you write it, it becomes real. And it's like, oh, I went through this. Okay, I'm going to need some help to deal with that. So I think for me, a lot of that is these broken spaces are when we relive out our traumas, right? Or when we live out challenges, right? And so as a Black person in America going through those experiences, you do live in these broken spaces because you are affected in a very different way than the general population. So you're not broken. And that's the other part too, right? The spaces are broken. And so if you start to see the spaces are broken or the systems are broken, then you start to view people as human beings, right? And so American Scapegoat is about recognizing the humanity in people, right? Especially Black people, you know, instead of being the boogeyman in your dreams, you know, being blamed for the scapegoat, right? For America's problems. It's more, I'm a human being. Look at the systems that are broken, because we need to fix the system and not the people, right? Because if you fix the systems, the people will start to get better. I often said during the pandemic, they're like, oh, black people are experiencing the pandemic, a lot harder than other people. And I said, well, okay, that's fine. Take care of the other stuff so that we can experience the pandemic like everybody else, But police shootings were happening during the pandemic, protests and so forth. So I was just like, can we take care of the other social policies, right? And the political threats, and then we can deal with life like everybody else. And so I think it was important for me to be able to say, you know what? It's not about what we think it's about. Let's address this in this way. And in that way, we're separating ourselves from, we can actually focus on what matters to us and what really ails us. So I think it's important to have a very good system and people that you trust so that you can reflect back and forth with them.
Yes. Which my one of my dogs made a premiere in the background. Yeah. I don't know if people.
Well, my boys are starting to pipe up too in the background.
So. Yes, I heard that too. I was like,
you heard them, right?
You rave for multiple intersecting identities, including as being a product of two countries, Black, Haitian-born, masculine-bodied, poet, educator, and social advocate. Your writing is uniquely yours, and I can imagine emerging writers dedicating poems to you and your work. I'd love for you to talk about why your literary voice is important now and what you hope to continue to contribute to the larger literary canon.
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that question because oftentimes the struggle was, how do I write from, as a Black American who's Haitian born? And so I spent, first, 9 to 10 years of my childhood in Haiti, and then the rest of my time has been here in the United States, right? So I'm very much American, but, in a much bigger conversation at a later time is that American policy was in Haiti way before I was born. And so in a lot of ways, there's been a lot of American policy in me, even before I got to this country. But that said, I started to think it was different, right? Like multiple identities. And at some point it became multiple personalities as well, right? Acting one way with different, one group and acting another way. When I started to blend those in there, I realized that I do come from the tradition of storytelling, right? Storytellers in Haiti. We used to, on Friday, Saturday nights, used to have story nights. So somebody would stand in the middle of the room and tell a story, right? And then another night, it would be riddles, right? And people would have to figure out what the person is saying. Now, as a kid, I wanted to contribute, but, as kids, you're not, you don't enter the circle of adult, entertainment. But when looking back, I said, that's part of my tradition as well. And so when I'm looking at canon, I don't necessarily look at what's been established, right? I look for the traces and the influences that have existed from the beginning, right? Like to take a look at the Harlem Renaissance and not acknowledge the influence of Caribbean writers, then you have a very specific canon, right? And it's a limited canon, but a lot of Caribbean writers were interacting with, African American writers. And so it became this sort of medley, of sorts, right? All the different parts. And I think being Caribbean born definitely helped with that. And so I could be writing and, rap is in my head, right? Or jazz. And so is, Haitian compas, right? And, and so is merengue, right? All those flavors, bachata, it's like just even saying those words, like changes the way that you flow with things. And I realized that that's also part of our personalities because we have diverse ways of speaking even. And so how do you tap into that and make that experience also literary? And I really had fun. It sounds fun. I had fun writing when my body was a clenched fist. As hard as the subject was, the writer in me, the poet in me really came to life because I realized how much I love language and how much language can do. And so when it came time to really revise American Scapegoat, and you see that in the number of the poems that I go even deeper than that and saying, what else can I do? how can I stretch this beyond what I've already done before? Because I don't want all my books to ever be the same. And sometimes you might read them and say, is this really written by the same writer? Um, because I come from a different place each time.
On your website, you are quoted as saying, every minute spent in a place where you're not supposed to be, a roll call somewhere goes unanswered and you're marked absent. Be present by aligning your thoughts, actions, and relationships with where you want to be with your life. How do you make yourself present as a writer?
It's a tricky question because for a long time I often ask, when people I'm in conversation with folks and they'll say, "Oh, I used to write," and I said, "What do you mean by that?" And they're like, "Well, I'm kind of a writer." And so I asked them, how do they write? And they'll explain they write in their journals and they write this and that. I said, "Well, you are a writer." They said, "Well, I don't have anything published." I said, "Well, it means you're not an author."
Mm.
And then they're like, "Oh, I guess you're right." And I said, "A writer writes." And you know this because everything becomes writing to you, and you view the world in that way, right? If the first thing you want to do when you wake up is write in the journal because you want to reflect, or you can't wait to write this down, then you find that you are a writer. I think it was giving myself permission to say that I am a writer and that I enjoy it as well, but also writing shapes my life. I was writing on napkins at restaurants when something came to me, the back of receipts. And I tell the youth, I said, don't go out and do this, but I take flyers off the wall, you know, if the poem was coming fast enough, and write on the back of that, right? I always carry a pen with me. In the day of technology now, my phone and the notes app is crucial,
Yes.
right? But sometimes I want something handwritten, so I always carry a pen with me, and maybe a notebook or a piece of paper that I fold in my pocket. So I think it was about accepting that, and allowing me to create my own space, right? To be a writer, that includes space in my own body, right, and space in my own mind, because writing is mental first before you actually transcribe it. So I thought like a writer. I've always thought like a writer. And I thought I was strange or weird as a kid. That's because I was asking questions as a writer, specifically as a poet, I'm like, I wonder if that tree's crying because it's sad, and or it's crying because it knows I'm sad, but I can't cry my own tears. Like, that
Mm.
was a question that I posed in junior high school. And who says something like that?
Right.
And who you say that to? And it's like, dude, okay, all right. So then you write it down, right? And so I think it is about the mentality of being a writer more than it is that leads you to the act of being a writer, right?
Mhm.
When you think about it in that way, it compels you to transcribe it. And that's a title no one can take away from you. No one can't say you're not a writer if you are writing. They might
Mm.
say, oh, you're not an author because you have not published, but anyone could be a writer, and I think more people are writers than they know.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'd love to talk about your relationship, speaking of publishing, with Black Lawrence Press. Black
Yes.
Lawrence Press published both When My Body Was a Clinched Fist and will be publishing American Scapegoat. Why Black Lawrence Press for both poetry collections?
So I believe in relationships, and I had a really good relationship from when I got the phone call that my manuscript was accepted. When my body was a clenched fist, and I kind of feel like all I needed was somebody to believe, right? And the conversation I had with my editor, Diane Garther, is we all read the book. All the editors read the book, and she reflected a lot of what I was doing in the book back to me. And so I was just like, okay, this sounds good. And we had a good relationship with working through When My Body Was the Clenched Fist, all the way to, the beautiful cover title, cover art, I should say, Chateau, When I Ruled the World, by, Cuban American painter, Carlos Rancagna, who's based out of Florida. And so it became like one of those things that I knew American Scapegoat in itself was just like a no brainer, right? Um, because Diane was just like, yes, and here's when we're going to publish it, you know, and we're not going to wait. You're going to know 2023 needs to come out then, as I mentioned before, to be ahead of the conversation, right? Or to already continue what you already started before that, because the momentum is key. And so I believe in working with good people, and I've had that a very good working relationship with, you know, with my publisher. And there was something about having a publisher that loves your work, you know, that empowered me to even write what I'm writing now, because it's like, okay, you know, somebody believes. And as I said, all I need is for one person, somebody to believe and to put the work out there. And so it's been a beautiful relationship with Black Lawrence Press, and I'm hoping we can do so much with this book, so much, so that way we are in talking circles that usually involve, you know, the big giant, you know, publishers, and that indie publishers are incredibly rich with poets and writers, you know, and they're publishing some very beautiful books as well. And so it's about showcasing that and celebrating together. So I look forward to that.
Yeah, I've already spoken into existence several accolades and awards for American Scapegoat already. I'm
Yes,
just saying.
yes, please. Thank you.
I'm just saying. And speaking of being someone who's about relationships,
Yeah,
I know you as someone who is very intentional about collaborations and collaborating. It seems to be a core value of yours, as demonstrated when we first met each other.
yeah, yeah.
In curating for the Tell Us Slant Festival, and the beautiful relationship that you have with Lisa Pegram, Michael Mercurio, Melanie Henderson, and other writers, publishers, publicists, educators, and creatives. So, how do these collaborations feed your work and your soul, and why is it important to you to collaborate with others?
So for me, the answer is simple, right? It's not a me, it's a we. And so I quickly turn that M upside down, right?
Mm.
It's a we. And I think because, as I mentioned, I come from a tradition, you know, the Haitian people are a we, right? As a country, that's the way it's always felt, right? If you didn't have enough, you kind of figured somebody else didn't have, you had more than somebody else, right? So it's
Mm.
almost like you always know that sharing with each other, you know, becomes part of that. And together we do things, right? You know, the whole yes we can with Obama and everything else like that. Like I've been living that, you know, like as a country, if we get ahead of, you know, all of that, we stay away from the I, right? The individual achievements. And I think anytime that I achieve something, it's a group, right? And that's why the next verse poets would call it connective, not a collective, right? Because
Mm.
our stories connect and our trajectories connect, right? And so if one of us rises, the other person comes up with us. And that's why they show up. And it's wonderful and it's beautiful, because it means that we're staying away from, again, trying to just shine for the sake of you shining by yourself, right? And I often say that it's great to be a star, but it's way better to be a constellation. And so
Oh.
that's what it's about for me. In fact, the there in my pronouns, right, is, and I go back and forth, right? It's because I don't want to go from his, like I've done this, as if no one else helped me with this, as if I don't come from a lineage, right, of people that pushed me and ushered me forward, right? So the there in my pronoun is to say their book, because I wrote it, yes, but I have a lot. I have ancestry, right? I have the
Mm.
ancestors guiding me. I have my family, you know, I have foundation, my tribe guiding me. And so because they allow me to do certain things, because they love me up, right? They make me
Mm.
feel safe. Then I'm free to do some of the things that I do. When these boys allow me to share even the space and time with you today, right?
Right. Well, they've been
You
so
know?
patient.
And so it's like there was one knock, but then they figured it out, right? And then I'm gonna, you know, treat them to dinner or something, you know, special.
Oh.
But they're sharing that space. And so my accomplishments is because they allow me to do that, right? Because I cannot write if there's not this back and forth, right? This space that they allow me to do it. So for me, it is community based, right? It's not a me, it's a we.
Mm. And I'm very much the same way too. Like
Yeah.
I wouldn't be a writer if it weren't for like Priscilla Page. I wouldn't be,
Mm,
funded if it weren't for like a Jason Montgomery or Diana
mm,
Alvarez. Like I like community is just, and Black Writers Read wouldn't be where it is without like
yeah.
Trenda Lofton and like the myriads of people who continue to support and like everything like that. And that's like community is such a huge like value of mine too. And that's why I was just like,
Yeah.
I need to get into all because I have a feeling that we, that
Yeah.
synergy is definitely present. And this
And that's why
leads,
we
yeah,
vibed in the first place, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
And this leads me to my second to last question, and your sons will get you back soon, I promise. You teach creative writing and literature at Bunker Hill Community College. You serve as founding editor and publisher at Central Square Press, and you're also the founder and executive director at the Faraday Publishing Company. Why position you, other than being a writer and, of course, father and social advocate and all of these things in librettist, why do you position yourself in these unique ways in the literary sphere as someone who I'm going to call on ancestor Toni Morrison? I see a lot of Toni Morrison in the work that you do.
Oh,
In
wow.
terms of how you want to position
Yeah.
people, particularly people who are very vital to your community. So why position yourself in these unique ways in the literary sphere? And then what is the mission of your work by serving in these roles?
Yeah. I think it's about the power of the narrative, right? And oftentimes, especially when it deals with marginalized groups, and even that term is limited, right, in scope because somebody has written who the marginalized groups are, right? And then you say to yourself, well, let me show you something, right? This is Emily Dickinson, right? Great poet. Yes, good. She was not celebrated at the time because why? Women were not taught to be as good as, right, men. And so they just decided to eliminate her. So women poets were marginalized. In fact, the numbers are what they are today too, where that's still pretty much relevant, right? And so when we talk about narratives and giving power to voice, I think that's why I inhabit all these different spaces. Each time is for something different, right? In the classroom is getting students to be comfortable in articulating their thoughts, right? And writing it down. Or if they don't see something reflected in the literature that is presented to them, write your story. One of my favorite classes to teach is the immigrant experience in literature, because I think, as we know, American culture defines immigrant as something extremely different. And part of that is the essence of American Scapegoat, but also into the next manuscript, right? Rumors of Our Demise. But it is about giving voice to your own experiences. So that way you can at least validate that for yourself, but then write the story for your own people as well, right? And in advocacy, it's the power of the word, the written word especially. Nothing gets changed in this country without something being written. And so literally it has to be written into law. We can talk all we want, campaign promises can be made, but until you sign something into law, we can't do anything. In fact, the most insidious part about the whole Breonna Taylor situation, I finally wrote a poem because I didn't want to leave that narrative out, but I also didn't want to write it from the standpoint that everybody had already done it, right?
Yeah.
And then it came to me and I realized that what they did was not against the law. It was against natural law, right, of human nature. But legally, that's why no one was charged, because it was not against the law what they did. But what was against the law was shooting somebody's closet. You cannot shoot aimlessly and randomly and then fire a shot and hit somebody's closet and their clothes. So by law, that closet was more protected than a human being because the closet showed recklessness. But based on the law, what they did with Breonna Taylor was not reckless. And so we have to say to ourselves, what does that even mean? Or well, it's not written into law, so there's nothing that we can do about it. And so all of a sudden, I teach folks, well, if it's not written, we need to write it. And if not enough people think this is a problem, then we need to keep writing. Because at some point, someone just say, oh, we should change this. And I'm like, you knew it was a problem way before I said anything. But why do I have to write about it for you to, like if you're hurting me, if I don't say ow, you're not gonna stop. And so I want folks to be able to bring their voices and by writing about it. And sometimes you discover that you are part of a much bigger narrative, right? That other people have written about it and that we can continue to push ourselves forward. So that way we do say 10 years from now, someone is going to try to change the story, which is why they're boycotting a lot of books, right? They're banning a lot of books because it's been written, right? It was written. It's been written. They want to deny that because that's the reality of American history, and it hurts. Of course, it's gonna hurt. You're looking in the mirror, and at some point you have to say. And the problem is not the fact that it's American history that they have a problem with. Is that what was written is prophetic in many ways because it's talking about what's happening now. Same thing that used to happen then when America was great. They're trying to make it great again, which means the Supreme Court decision, Roe versus Wade, was bound to be overturned because that's the way it was back then. Women had no rights. Women didn't get to vote until ... So, and so you say to yourself, why are they limiting that? And so for me, it's all about liberation because you may not get a microphone, but no one can prevent you from putting pen to paper. And so wherever it is, you don't have paper, you write in the sand, right? Young people in the 80s, 90s, they use spray can, let me just write this, Basquiat just wrote, on the walls as a way of expressing, because all of a sudden you realize that writing gives us that freedom. And so whether I'm teaching, publishing, social advocacy, editing, or even simply having a conversation, I'm always talking about the power of the written word.
I was not waiting for this moment, but this is my very last question. I feel like we could talk forever, but I'm like, your sons, you need to get back to your family.
Yeah. One more question, Michael.
Yes. What is next for you, and how can the Black Writers Read community support you on this journey?
Well, what's next for me is getting the American Scapegoat tour going, right? And getting that conversation going. And currently we're in the pre-order phase of things, right? Which, as you know, is the lifeline of a book before it comes out. But I think more importantly, it's about conversations, right? Whether it's the manuscripts that I'm working on, this current book, I want us to continue that conversation. So it starts, yes, if you have the book, then we can talk about specifics, kind of like we talked about today. And I can talk about craft, I can talk about the subject, the themes, and so forth, right? But also invitations, like invite me for conversations. I love to talk about these things because, as you mentioned, hearing me read something is very different than reading it, in the book itself. Plus, when we take a look at the type of conversations we're having, sometimes I'm inspired to read something differently because of the space that I'm in. And so then we get a very different type of revelation in terms of that. So I want to do more conversations, more readings, even book clubs, to be able to sit down and say, okay, we're going to, take a look at this one line. Let's talk about it. What does it mean? Because for me, that's valuable because writing is not the end. For me, I write to start a conversation or to continue a conversation. And there's been a lot of conversations that started way before me that I'm continuing, and others as a new generation I'm ushering in to say, let's start to talk about that. And hopefully we continue along that line. And then the last part is insight. I want to trigger something that says, I want to do this. I want to inspire people to say, I want to do this too. I want to change the way I perceive this, or I'm going to do something about it. And so I think as you're reading this and you're hearing me, it's great to sit and be fed, right? But then what are you going to do with that, nourishment, right? You're supposed to expand that energy, right? Or else we become stationary in our modes, right? And in which case it's wasted energy, right? Or wasted nutrition,
Yeah.
right? So let's put it to work. We eat so that our bodies can move and do stuff. So in this case, if we're consuming all of this knowledge together, like you fed me a lot today, so I'm gonna use that, as a way of going forward. And so if it means paying it forward, then yes. If it means just reflecting and writing in a different way, then I'm gonna do that as well. So hopefully we can, continue a conversation. That's all I'm hoping for.
Yes. And speaking of, this is a great way to announce this. And I want to get you slated for it. This summer, we're actually, Black Writers Read is launching Black Writers Summer Reads. We're going to be doing virtual book clubs. And
Wow.
I'm so excited. And the difference in that we are inviting the author, which will be a previous guest of Black Writers Read, to be in conversation with those who have read the book. So I'm super excited, and I want to get you slated on that.
That's wonderful. I love that.
I'm so excited.
I love that. You're becoming the next Oprah right now,
Oh!
You know what I'm saying?
Oh!
And I'll come on and be like, Enzo Silon.
Yes! And check under your seats.
You get a book.
You get a book. You get a book. You get a book. Check under your seats. There's even more books.
That's wonderful. I love that. I love that. It's a great thing to do. And like you said, we need to be more in conversation with each other in that way. And I love that. Yes. I love that.
So Enzo, I am beyond just fulfilled from today's conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I would love for you to get back to your sons now.
Well, you can tell, like, they're like, okay, the inner clock went off, and it's like an hour has passed. So you know,
you said you're only gonna be out.
And they hold you to it, and they're like, you said an hour. I don't care if we're playing video games. You said an hour. What's going on?
I love that. I love that. I love that so much. So thank you so much. Have a great afternoon. And
thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yes, have fun with your sons this afternoon. Take care.
Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
So thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon for Black Writers Read. I will be back on April 16th with doula, writer, and trauma sensitivity book coach Danielle Jernigan to talk about her work in her new podcast, which is scheduled to launch in May. So find me and more about Black Writers Read online at NicoleMYoung.com. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel to keep up with episodes of both Black Writers Read and my other projects. Also, be sure to subscribe to the audio podcast, which is available on Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. So we'd love to thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and more importantly, for ensuring Black authors continue to matter. See you next Sunday.